Why do different Christian groups have different Bibles? Almost all Christians everywhere use the same 27-book New Testament canon. But the same can't be said for the Old Testament. When I was a college student, I took a course called Bible as Literature, and I was assigned the Oxford Annotated Bible. Now, this Oxford Annotated Bible had a section in it called the Apocrypha, and I didn't really know very much about this, but it had some books in it that I hadn't heard of before. This raised questions for me. Why weren't these books in my Bible? What should I think about them? Are these inspired texts? Now, maybe you were raised Roman Catholic and you notice that in the Protestant Bible, some books are missing. Or maybe you're a Protestant and you were browsing through a bookstore. You came across a Roman Catholic Bible and noticed that there are some extra books in the Old Testament. Well, what's that about? Well, the reasons for this are pretty long and complicated. We usually talk about Christianity in three different groups. The Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church more or less officially separated from one another during the 11th century. And then there's a third group, Protestants. As a Methodist, I'm a Protestant. The Protestant Reformation, the beginnings of Protestantism, began during the 16th century. These different groups have different versions of the Old Testament. Protestants have the shortest Old Testament canon, using the same basic set of writings that is in the Hebrew Bible. Roman Catholics have an additional 7 books that were included in the Septuagint, but not in the Hebrew Bible. Now, you may remember from an earlier session, the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Old Testament that contains some writings that were not in the Hebrew Bible. Eastern Orthodox churches may vary exactly on what works to include, but they do include more than the 39 recognized by Protestants. Now, in the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, they call these works that we Protestants don't have deuterocanonical. Deuteros in Greek means second, and it's thought that these works were recognized as inspired at a later time. Protestants generally don't use that language. Normally, as Protestants, we talk about these works as apocrypha. And the word apocrypha just means the things that are hidden away. Why are they called apocrypha? That's not exactly clear. How did they become apocrypha? That's another story. St. Jerome lived during the 4th and 5th centuries. He was the most brilliant biblical scholar of his time. And he was commissioned by the Pope to produce a new Latin translation of the Bible. There had been Latin translations before this, but Jerome's translation would surpass all of these. His translation came to be called the Vulgate, and it was the official translation of Roman Catholics for centuries. The word Vulgate is related to our English word vulgar, but it really just means common. A lot of people, especially people in the Western Roman Empire, spoke Latin, and so this was a Bible in the language of the common people. Now, at first, Jerome wanted to produce a translation into Latin from the Septuagint, in other words, from Greek into Latin for the Old Testament. But he began to realize that for the most accurate text possible, he needed to go back earlier than the Greek for the Old Testament. He needed to get back into the Hebrew. Well, he didn't know Hebrew, so he went to Jerusalem, studied with a rabbi, and learned Hebrew, and then translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin. He also translated those works that weren't in the Hebrew Bible, these apocryphal or deuterocanonical works, as we call them today, translated those into Latin also, but he regarded them as having a different status from the works that were in Hebrew, and he indicated as much in prefaces in the Vulgate that he produced. Later copyists simply didn't follow Jerome's precedent. and they left out any distinction between these works that were in the Hebrew Bible and the works that were only in the Septuagint. And so these additional works over time came to occupy the same status as works that had been in the Hebrew Bible. Now fast forward to the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther decides that he wants to follow the practice of Jerome. And so he takes these works and he puts them in a separate section, the Apocrypha. Luther said that these works were profitable for reading, but that they didn't occupy the same status as the inspired works of Scripture and should not be used for establishing doctrine. Later Protestant reformers accorded these works even lower status than Luther did. Now, one reason that the reformers had a problem with the works of the Apocrypha is that some of these works were used by Roman Catholics to support disputed doctrines. So, for example, let's look at 2 Maccabees 12:43 through 45. This is about a person in ancient Israel. This is about a figure named Judas Maccabeus who led a revolt against a group called the Seleucid Empire. He also took up a collection, man by man, to the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver and sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a sin offering. In doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore he made atonement for the dead, so that they might be delivered from their sin. Now you can see Protestants would have some problems with this passage. For one thing, it's used to support the idea of purgatory. It was used to support the idea of masses from the dead. Protestants weren't on board with that, and so that's one of the reasons that they thought, well, maybe this shouldn't occupy the same status as other works that we consider sacred scripture. Another example is Tobit 12:9. For almsgiving saves from death and purges all sin. Those who give alms will enjoy a full life. Well, that sounds like works righteousness. Almsgiving purges from sin. But it's a key Protestant doctrine that we can't earn our salvation. Almsgiving won't purge us from sin. Only the cross of Christ can do that. Sirach 3:30 reads, as water quenches a flaming fire, so almsgiving atones for sins. It's the same issue here. So the Protestant Old Testament consists of 39 books. Roman Catholic and Orthodox Old Testaments have more works than that. This is just a point of disagreement between our traditions. The removal of these works from the canon of Scripture, the idea that they should be put in a different section called Apocrypha, dates back to the time of Jerome, but it was really picked up again by Martin Luther, who had a tremendous influence on Protestantism even to this day.